Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia.
The mysterious disappearance in 1967 of Australia's 17th Prime Minister Harold Holt while swimming at a Victorian beach has been the subject of countless books, news articles and podcasts. Holt's remains have never been found, and to this day, conspiracy theories abound over whether the disappearance was a tragic case of drowning or something more sinister. However, there is an aspect to this story that has been less examined, and that is the role of his then wife, Zara, whose own life as a fashion entrepreneur, along with her passionate and lifelong love affair with Harold, makes for a fascinating story. Fortunately, our guest today on Talking Aussie Books has stepped into the breach with her novel, The Secret Year of Zara Holt, which gives a full-colour portrait to the woman who so captivated our 17th Prime Minister. Listeners, my name is Cassie. I'm an author and your guest host for this episode with fellow author Kimberley Freeman. Kim, welcome to the podcast and congratulations on the novel. Can you tell me how you first heard the Zara Holt story and what about it piqued your interest?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me, Cassie, and for your kind words about the book. The book had its origins in, I was having a brunch with some friends in publishing, and, we were talking about book ideas and that kind of thing. And we had also been talking about the kind of books that reimagine the lives of real women, like, for example, Curtis Sittenfield's Rodham comes to mind. Or even the way that a TV series like The Crown imagined the royal family as characters and followed along with the facts, but also imagined their inner lives. So we were having a good conversation about this, and one of my colleagues said, I would love to see an Australian book like that. And so it was almost like a game, like who from Australian history, what woman obviously from Australian history would be interesting to write about that way. And I was really stuck on the idea that Carolyn Chisholm would be a good one, right? She's on the $5 note. Everybody knows who she is. What else do we know about her apart from, just the bare facts that we might have learnt in primary school? But then somebody said, what about Zara Holt? And I said, I don't even know who that is. And she said, it's the woman who was married to Harold Holt. So I quickly Googled her and I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it was that moment where I went, I have never heard of this woman. If anything, I've heard, the only reason I would know of her is because of her famous husband. She was an astonishing woman who had an astonishing life. And, at one point, her fashion company, MAG, which she founded when she was 19, it did have a hiatus, but nonetheless, in the 1950s and 60s was one of Australia's top 3 couture houses. And I had never heard of her. She was responsible for bringing some of the biggest fashion designers in the world, their products into Australia, like Pierre Cardin. She was so influential and such an interesting person. When I got home, I kept Googling her because I was looking at pictures and dresses and pictures of her. And I found a sort of front cover of a book with her face on it. And it was a memoir that she wrote in the year following Harry's death. And just on a whim, it was like at a secondhand bookshop. I just ordered it on a whim and then forgot about it. And then the book turned up and I started reading it. And that's when I went, oh, there's a novel in here. Because obviously she was writing it in the wake of Harry's death. It was largely about her life with him. So the book structurally, her memoir structurally, about a quarter of it was her life before she got married to Harry, and about 3/4 of it was her public life. Whereas for me, all of the interesting stuff was in that first quarter. So my book has the opposite structure. About 3/4 of it is the time when she was single, when she was married to another man, when she traveled all around the world, when she started her own business, when she survived as a single parent during World War II. That's all in my book, and that's most of my book. And then about the last quarter does cover that, the last few years of her life when she was the treasurer's wife and then the Prime Minister's wife. So
So interesting to hear, because your book also sent me down a rabbit hole of trying to find out more about Zara Holt. And if the job of historical fiction is to raise our interest in history, your book absolutely does that. And like you, though, I found there was really not that much information on her early life and specifically her fashion career. So I'm wondering, how did you go about researching that? Were there many primary sources that you could find?
It was very difficult. The memoir provided me with some things, but she just glosses over stuff. She was 19 and she and her best friend, who was so scandalous, her best friend, she could write a novel about Betty James as well. They were young fools and they started, a fashion house, and it did so well that they both burnt out, and they had to stop, they had to sell the business. But she'll just gloss over that in half a page in her memoir. So yes, I have to go and find other things. And you start on the internet, of course, because there's a lot there. But actually, where I found the true gold was in the National Library of Australia. There's a archive. Obviously, there's a Harold Holt archive, and there is a Zara Holt archive. And it didn't fill in all the gaps, but it provided some tent pegs to sort of hold up the structure. And then I had to fill it with my imagination. I'm at the point now, and it's been a while since I finished writing the book, and the book actually did take me a while to write. But people are often asking me, is this true or did you make this up? And I actually have lost sight of, because for me, it was such an immersive experience, and I knew certain things and I was imagining the space in between them, and that all just became true to me, or real, I should say, rather than true, because obviously I don't know what she was thinking and feeling. So there were certain facts. I had some good pictures. There's some great pictures in the archive, including a lovely picture of Zara and Betty dressed in beautiful late 1920s clothes or early 1930s clothes when they actually opened the store. And every now and again, I'd find a little thing like, that was the address that it was at, or, that was the year that they started up again. But it's not, it was really quite difficult to pin down details.
Because there's also a really evocative section where Zara starts to travel the world. And I don't want to spoil anything, but one way and another, she finds herself living in India. And I'm interested specifically how you drew those scenes, because I imagine that's not a portion of her life that she would have written about.
No, there's, I think, a half a chapter on India, and I used as much as I possibly could of her memoir, of her memories. And I'll come back to the idea again of truth and emotional truth, because her memoir in itself has got some stuff in it that I'm not sure is true. But we'll come back to that if you like. But I have been to India myself, and I've never written about it. I went for work, but it did give me an opportunity to sort of haul out those kind of observations of the way that the sunlight falls and the way that the air feels and things like that. But there's actually quite a lot on the internet written about India during that period. So, and with some really good photographs. So I was able to sort of use that to set the scene. And then I used some of her reflections on the sort of human interactions that she'd had to create the narrative across that part. That was my favorite part of writing the book. And in fact, in the original version that I sent away to my publishers, it was much longer. They cut it back. They're like, oh, well, we've been in India for quite a long time. And it's like, yeah, but it's so great there.
Well, and it shows some really interesting things about her character, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But for the moment, we'll just stay on the research. And I'm really interested in this idea of blending truth
Mm.
with emotional truth and imagining what the situation would have been like for Zara. I imagine that is so much harder as well when you're writing about a real person who has descendants who are still very much alive. And I'm wondering, what are your sort of guiding ethical principles as to where you allow your imagination to roam free and where you try specifically to stay to the facts as we know them?
Oh, that is such a great question. And I've got a couple of ways of approaching that. The first one is, as I said, I read her memoir. I also read a biography of Harold Holt, and his official biographer is on the record as saying that Zara's memoir is largely inaccurate.
Hmm,
And
interesting.
did it make you feel that as well? Because Sure, she might have got some dates and events wrong, but what she was writing was her emotional truth. She was writing about her life, how much she loved Harry, as she called him, and where they went with that, what places they went and things they did. And I mean, if I had to write a memoir of my life, I'd get all kinds of things wrong because I wouldn't be interested
Mm.
in when the Prime Minister did a certain thing. I'd be interested in how I was feeling. So, in a way, reading that, and of course, he's just got a different burden of proof that he needs to see for something to be nonfiction. For him, that's fine. He's allowed to feel that way. But for me, it really freed me up because I thought, well, if Zara is writing in this kind of personal, intimate, emotional way about her feelings and her reflections, then that allows me to do that too. Because there's no way you can write somebody's life without, skipping over important events or blending characters into one or just ignoring something altogether because it's just going to create, a cul-de-sac in the story. A story has to have a certain pace and rhythm. And so it allowed me to, as you say, blend fact with imagination. And in fact, the whole book, I mean, without giving spoilers away, is about the limits of the imagination. When we think about Harold Holt, so much about what happened to him is still in our imaginations, as you said, because we never found a body. He drowned, he disappeared at sea. But, all that stuff about Chinese submarines and, whatever else is us imagining a different outcome. So the whole book, it's one of the themes of the story, as you would know because you read it. I guess the other thing is, what did I think about the Holt family? Because, yeah, I did look around and I could see that two of her sons at the time were still alive while I was writing it. And grandchildren, obviously, including two of her granddaughters, Sophie and Pippa, are both fashion designers. And I spoke to a friend at length about this, about whether or not I should get in touch with them or whether or not I should just write the book and give her a different name. That would have been pretty obvious when the Prime Minister disappeared who she was. In the end, I didn't because I thought one of two things will happen. Either they won't want me to write it and then I don't get to write the book, which I really wanted to write, or they really want me to write it, but they want me to stick more to the facts. They want, because they're invested. It's somebody that they loved. So I didn't, and nobody ever pays that much attention to my books. And then this book is just, I don't know if you've seen, but I've had quite a lot of press and stuff like that. And then about 3 weeks ago, Zara's grandson, Robert Holt, got in touch with me. And I'm going to get teary telling you this. He said it was the most, how much he loved it, how much his father, Sam, Zara's last remaining son, also enjoyed it, and how much it allowed him to remember his grandmother, who he had been very close to.
Mm.
And then the next thing you know, I had to do an event at the Noosa Festival, a Q&A, like an in conversation. And the original host was unable to come, so they got Robert to do it. I got to spend some time with him on stage having a chat about this incredible woman. I mean, she's freaking iconic, right? I got the sense of it from writing the book, but hearing this other side of who she was really from Robert was just amazing. Like, just what an incredible, unique, singular person she was. So, I mean, that was something I could never have expected would come from writing this book.
And that comes through so strongly in the book. There's a real sense that you've captured her emotional essence. And in some ways, Zara is a bit of a conundrum. She's terrible at maths and academia generally, but she's a wonderfully talented designer. She's very glamorous, but she's very insecure in the book about her looks. She's quite ambitious for her career, but she's also absolutely desperate to settle down and have children. She just seems like one of those people who had a real knack of being well liked and quite practical and approachable. She comes across as a woman who was of her time, but also ahead of her time. Was that the impression that you drew from reading her memoir?
Yeah, 100%. I think that was the thing, reading her memoir and seeing all of those, as you say, those paradoxes about her. I was like, she feels so modern. I mean, every woman I know is like, career, oh, but family. The media can't tell me what's beautiful, but oh, do I look a little bit fat in this? I don't know a woman who's not a little bit like that. And she felt so modern on the page. I think that's what drew me to write, because, I was halfway through the memoir before I went, yeah, I'm definitely going to do this. But she just felt, and she's got such a lovely voice. She's got a self-deprecating voice, but at the same time, she'll tell you when, "Oh, I did a very clever thing." But she's also obsessed with fairies, like literally away with the fairies, loved to dream about fairies and draw fairies and things like that. She just felt like someone who I would love to have as a friend. And yeah, she was of her time as well. I mean, some of the things she says in the memoir, and I'm sure some of the things that she said while alive were, probably not that palatable now. But I mean, she was of her time, and she and Harry were really, really strong humanitarians. They really cared about other people in a way that, sometimes I feel like politicians don't. Politicians seem to be obsessed now with campaigning rather than governing, whereas I think at the time it might have been different. And she definitely saw herself as somebody who was a humanitarian, who cared about people. It's always difficult when you're writing historical fiction about a woman who you admire to make them too modern. But I really didn't with her. She just was. I got the sense that she was a bit bohemian and just a bit able to see outside the regular frame. Though she was also constrained by that frame as a woman who was married to a very famous politician in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, she wasn't backwards about telling people her opinions of things. And yeah, a really inspiring woman, a trailblazer, I would say.
Definitely a trailblazer in terms of what she achieved in her career. But gosh, some of the sexism of the era made me want to scream. Like,
Oh,
she would have this amazing achievement with opening a new store, for example, and it would be covered in the media, but she would be referred to as Mrs. Harold Holt. And in many ways, his career had to come first. Once he was a minister and then prime minister, she
yeah.
had to, step away from the business to some degree and travel with him. And I think you've alluded to this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but just how successful was her fashion company, Mag Designs?
They were really highly regarded, and they had shops all over the place. They were couture until they weren't. They started bringing in designs from overseas. They had fashion shows overseas as well, really successful. They designed, I can't remember how many, but some of the Olympic uniforms were designed by Zara Holt. She was actually quite well known for it in her lifetime, and then sort of forgotten by history, sort of overshadowed by, I mean, what other country has lost a prime minister that way? That's really something, right? The prime minister goes swimming and doesn't come back. It was really nice to sort of restore her reputation in that way. But the thing I loved the most about reading her memoir was, because some of those details about just how successful she was are elusive in the records. But what's really comes through very clearly in her memoir is how much she enjoyed designing, what she could do with it, her sort of generosity of attention, her ability to look at someone and just go, I know exactly what will look best on you. Because I could see that so clearly in the memoir, I sort of focused on that. I focused on her love for the creating the fashion. Usually when I write a historical novel, I have to get my head around 3 years worth of fashion, 40 years worth.
As you say, she seemed to have a knack of dressing women appropriate to their bodies. And when you look at photos of Zara, you can't help but notice that she's not a stick figure model. She is a woman with real curves, and she understood how to dress herself and many other body types. But
Yeah.
I want to turn now to talking a little bit more about the relationship, this lifelong love affair that she had with Harry, who she met as a teenager, just on a very normal Saturday night, went to a party, meets this guy. They have an instant and inescapable connection.
Yeah.
But they don't marry for nearly, is it
20
20
years?
years? 20 years. And there's
Yeah.
some fantastic twists and turns that I won't go into, because that's a really significant question
Mhm.
in the book, and readers will have to pick up the book themselves to find out what I'm talking about. But what is a matter of sort of public record now, I suppose, is that Harold Holt was a womanizer
Yeah.
and seemingly incapable of being faithful to any woman, including his wife Zara, who he seemed to really love and adore. And it's so interesting that you mentioned the book Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, because that's one that really came to mind for me when I
Yeah.
was reading your book, because I do see some parallels between the Hillary Clinton experience with her husband, Bill. And I thought specifically about an interview that Hillary Clinton gave in the late 90s, where she described her husband, the president, as a hard dog to keep on the porch. And yet their relationship lasted decades and decades. I definitely think there are some similarities between Zara and Harry, though his entanglements with others seem to be somewhat of an open secret that Zara certainly did know about. So I'm wondering, what do you think was at the heart of the connection here?
Yeah, that Zara did know about these things. Yes. There's a beautiful little piece of footage of her in her older age, and someone's asking her about, did you know about Marjorie, the woman that he had a very long affair with? And she just says, yes. Sometimes I wanted to tell her about the other half dozen women he was doing it with. so, so she definitely did know, but it really hurt her. It really caused her pain. It just comes off the page in the memoir, but also there's a lot of travel diaries in the National Archive. They adored each other. They adored each other. From the moment they met, you get the sense that he had figured it out, she was the one, and she felt the same way. There was clearly immense chemistry between them. And of course, she doesn't write about that. It's all between the lines that she was a passionate woman, she was given to mood swings, absolutely. He was a passionate, fiery man who, as you said, he loved women. He loved them. So there was no way that I could imagine them any other way than being passionately sexually attracted to each other and it just not going away. It just, especially because, as you say, it took them 20 years to get married. She married someone else first. He couldn't get his act together to propose. He didn't want to settle down. So she went off and married somebody else. I mean, as you know from the book, and I don't want to give it away, it got really, really complicated to the point where Zara's back in Melbourne with 3 little children. World War II's happening. She can't marry Harry because she's still married. Has to wait 5 years for that to come through. And just so complicated because he was a public figure. They couldn't be seen as being in a relationship together, though they obviously were. Yeah, really interesting. And then finally, they get married. And then, yeah, he just keeps getting off the porch, as Hillary Clinton would say, and hurting her. It really hurt her. But there's no doubt right until the end, even when he was seeing other women, he adored her. There's in some of the travel diaries, in Harold's words, he'll be saying these beautiful things like, oh, Zara's worried about how much she's eating. She's worried about her weight, but she looks so gorgeous. He'll say, oh, Zara got great attention for the dress that she wore. He's so proud of her, just adored her. And I wanted to capture that, right? 40 tumultuous years that they had together. There was never a moment where, when they were maybe up in North Queensland with their bohemian friends, but there didn't seem to be a lot of time just to be quiet and still. It looked quite tumultuous.
It's interesting that clip you referred to from the documentary in 1985, I think it is, where Zara says, yes, I knew about Marjorie, who was there that day that Harry went missing. And then there's a second part to that clip where she sort of says that Harold did his best to keep his affairs secret from her and that she made a conscious decision early in the marriage to look the other way. But if Harry had not been discreet, then she would have had to make a fuss and leave him, which is an interesting claim and one I'm not quite sure I believe. Do you think there really was any option for Zara to leave her husband?
She did leave him when she went off overseas and married somebody else. She did. The thing is, she came back. So I think she might have left him, but I don't think she would have stayed away. That's what I think would have happened if she had left him. But it was a different time. And also it wasn't that uncommon what he was doing. Lady Bird Johnson had the same problem with Lyndon, and Lady Bird Johnson I don't know if you know this, was a millionaire in her own right before she even met Lyndon Baines Johnson. So again, a really powerful, incredible woman who just for some reason put up with this stuff because that's what you did at the time. So yeah, I think married men having an affair, very common at the time. Having that kind of passionate attachment to each other, not as common. And I don't think she would have given that up. Not for long.
It's interesting. I mean, reading it, it sort of reminded me how we live today, I think, in a far more, in some ways, puritanical society where people would be like, girl, don't put up with that kind of womanizing. You should
Take
leave
it to
him.
the
But
curb.
it
Yeah.
was a different time, and we don't really have the right, I guess, to judge women of history by the standards of today. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the writing of this book and what that was like for you, and the challenges of it, what you found most difficult, or was this an easier one to write?
It was not easy. It was so hard. Oh my God, it was so hard. And I went into it like, la la la. This is gonna it's gonna be easy because I've got a timeline of events. I don't have to make up a plot. It's all right there. And then, I just start chasing down the details and make up what I can't find. And, once I'd made my peace with the fact that I was going to be writing about a real person, I spoke to a friend who just said, just write about her like you write about a sister. Don't do anything that would, drag her into disrepute. And I just became so fond of her that that was natural to me. It's like, I'm not going to, show a bad side of her or make up something awful about it, whatever. So I thought this is going to be easy. And then it just wasn't. It just wasn't because I think, yes, because she was a real person and I wanted to do it right. I didn't want to just sort of dash it off and go, oh yeah, this is just my version of Zara Holt, whatever. I was so captivated by her and her voice that I really wanted to spend the time getting her voice right. And it goes over 40 years. Like she's, a teenager when it starts. And so she's going to sound different because it's all in first person. She's going to sound different as a teenager than she's going to sound when she's, in her late 50s or in her mid 30s when she's got little. It was so hard. It was so hard. And then right in the middle of it, my own marriage broke down. So I shelved the whole thing. I thought it's not in anybody's best interest that I write this book. I shelved the whole thing for months. And my publishers, bless them, were so patient. I'm sure that at some point they thought, oh, we're never going to see this book. I mean, this is going to sound cheesy, but it is true. She overcame, again, this makes me really emotional. She overcame losing him. 40 years. She loved him for 40 years. And as you sort of said earlier, it's almost a punchline. Harold Holt, the Prime Minister that, disappeared. But that was real to her. That really happened to her. She was standing on the beach that day and she knew he wasn't coming back. Just the thought that she had managed to overcome that made me think, well, you can overcome a marriage breakdown. It's not like you're the only woman in the world who's ever been through one. So I got back on the writing horse and let her, I guess, inspire me. So I have this sort of close relationship with this imaginary version of a person who is real. And it's the weirdest thing ever. But at the same time, it seemed to work for me. So
Oh, you've definitely captured it on the page because I fell in love with her a little bit as well. And I think that's why it made me a bit obsessed with finding out all I could about her. As you said, the book is written in the first person, which really works well because you have a sense of having this direct connection with a person telling their own story. But was that always going to be the choice?
yeah, there was no other way of doing it because her memoir's written in first person. So it was more straightforward to imagine how she would speak. And then I only ever wanted it to be in her viewpoint. There was no one else's version of the story I wanted. I didn't want to get into Harry's head. I wanted it to feel really intimate because it is a long stretch of history and a lot of things happen. There's a kind of epicness about it that I didn't want to get swallowed up. I wanted to, create that intimacy and keep people close to the character so that the story can be big, but it always feels like you're, you know, just in a pocket. You know what I mean? Just very close to the story.
One other interesting thing that you do, and it's how the book starts, which is sort of to imagine a slightly different ending for Harry after he goes missing. And I'm wondering what was the thinking behind doing that. And we see a few snippets of what is framed as interludes, which is the imagined secret year after Harry has died. And I'm curious as to how that came about as a choice that you made.
It came about because, as I said earlier, that really happened to her. To us, it happened to somebody else. To her, it happened to the person closest to her. So if the whole country, in fact, the whole world, was imagining what had actually happened that day, there was never a body found. Surely she did too. Surely you would keep hoping that he would turn up. And surely then, especially because he had been so unfaithful and always in the world, never, you could never sort of get hold of him. He would wake up in the morning and start work immediately. Surely the kind of life that she would imagine with him would be where it was just her and him. And so that's why I started thinking about, how would she imagine that time? And of course, the actual year after Harry died was immense for her. She went overseas for the memorials and she won awards and got a damehood. Again, I imagine this first year is just this kind of dream life that she has, which is not ultimately, as she discovers, possible. That's what I mean about the limits of the imagination. You can't imagine somebody back from the dead, but I'm sure that she, like everybody who loses somebody, probably tried at some point.
That footage of Dame Zara walking around Portsea after Harry's gone missing and she's with the police is quite heartbreaking
I
because we
can't
know that he's not going to be found.
I can't watch it anymore. Obviously that's where I started and I can't even. It's too much for me because I love her so much. It's
And
really,
you can imagine the emotional
mm,
turmoil that's going on, but
yeah,
it was complicated, I think, by the fact that Marjorie, the mistress, was the one who was present when her husband disappeared. And your book sort of has its final note in that year after Harry has died. But I was curious as to what actually happened to Zara, and you can find out online that she did go on to marry again, another politician. She lived until 1989. She died on the Gold Coast, but interestingly, she was buried in Sorrento, not
yeah.
far from Harry went missing. Did you get a sense of how those final 20 years were for Zara?
I didn't read as much into them, and certainly I know a lot more now that I've met her grandson, who told me some really quite incredible stories. But yeah, that area apparently around Portsea and Sorrento is very important to their entire family. That is why she ultimately was buried there. And it's not for me to tell some of the stories that Robert did tell me about the family and the stories around who's in which grave and so on. But yeah, it was a very important place for them. It was one of the first places I went when I was researching the book, just to get a sense of it. Very
Mm.
beautiful coastline, but you look at the water and you go, what the hell was he doing in that water?
I think he had a great sense of his own abilities in the water, and by all reports, he was a super accomplished swimmer, but it sounded like the conditions that day were just not
Yeah.
suitable for even the best swimmer to go into, I think. But I just want to turn a little bit to your career more generally, because it's such a fascinating publishing career. You've had 30 novels published across a couple of different genres, across fantasy, where you write as Kim Wilkins. You've written, of course, in historical fiction, young adult, and children's fiction. I believe you have a day job as a professor of writing at the University of Queensland. So I'm just wondering, how does writing fit into your life? When do you actually get it done?
That's a great question. At the moment, I don't have a lot of time to write. When I was a little girl, my favorite thing in the world was to find a little nook under my house, have a fresh notebook, and just sit there and make up imaginary people and imaginary stories about them. And that was the best feeling in the world. And my whole life is just trying to get back there, trying to get back to that feeling. I make time to write not because, I'm thinking about the publishing industry. Of course, I've been very lucky to have been published, but those 30 books represent 30 incredible journeys that I've been on in my imagination. And, people that I made up that aren't real, who sort of live on inside me in some ways, worlds, especially with the fantasy novels, worlds that I created and inhabited for one of my, I wrote 3 fantasy novels all in the same world. So, and that took, I don't know, 8 years or something like that. So that's a long time to spend in an imaginary place. So I sometimes feel as though I've lived 2 lives. The one that I actually live on a day-to-day basis, where I show up at work and am highly effective. And then this other completely sort of parallel life where I've just, wandered in and out of historical periods and fantastic worlds, met people who aren't real. I feel so incredibly blessed that that has been my life. And, if I, when I'm elderly, if I should, lose my mind, hopefully I'll lose my mind in one of the nice ones, not one of the horror novels I wrote when I was young. Lose my mind in one of those places because they're so vivid to me. They're so real to me. And that's why meeting Zara's grandson was so, it was beautiful, but it was so wild. It was like, oh, okay, that's not a fictional character. That's actually a real person. I couldn't have been more sort of surprised if one of my actual made up characters, someone had come up and said, oh, I knew her. I feel so very blessed.
That's so beautiful. I love hearing how much solace and comfort you take in your writing and how it's really an exercise, I suppose, in serving that inner child. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering though, given that you do work, I suppose, in teaching writing, what's the advice that you find yourself most often giving to other writers about having that experience that you've had in writing?
The number one piece of advice I always give is that you have to love it. And if you're not loving it, you've got to stop doing it. I think a lot of people think, I want to be a writer and have an idea of what that is, which is, it's not like, I don't know, being a physiotherapist. You go and study physiotherapy and then you go and set up a business or whatever and be a physiotherapist. It's completely random whether or not you get published, what kind of publishing career you have, all of those kind of things, just so random. And it's a lot of time and a lot of mental energy to invest if you don't love it. So when I sometimes people will say, oh, I haven't been working on my novel because I just don't have time to write. I'm so exhausted at the end of the week and blah, blah, blah. And I want to say to them, and sometimes I do say to them, writing is the place you go because you're tired. Writing is so you've had a crappy week and everybody was awful to you and you're exhausted. The worst thing you can do is lie on your couch and scroll through Instagram. Go and get back into your story because that will nurture you and give you imaginative release and inspire you and all of those things. So that's the advice I usually give is, if you're acting out of passion, if you're curious about the process, like rather than thinking, oh, I've got to write this many chapters so I can get this out to a publisher or whatever. If you're thinking, I'm just going to write this scene and be really curious about what extra detail I can add to it or what atmosphere I can sort of, get to emerge from it, or what, even like what words, what verbs can I use that are going to be a bit different, that are going to elevate the sentences, just each little part, with a bit of curiosity, just focusing on the process. That's how you get that feeling that you had when you were 8. That's how you get it back. Because I never thought about publishing books when I was 8. I just thought about immersing in a world.
Wow, they are really beautiful words. This idea of writing being restorative and a joy and a place in which to retreat. And it's probably the right note to wind up our conversation today. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Kim. And as I said, the book is fantastic and a really emotional, truthful representation of an overlooked woman of history. So, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.